Awesome. And today will be our eighth and final webinar of the official learning journey. Using finger quotes because it's not like learning stops after this. It's not like our relationships and our conversations come to an end. And actually, that's really what we're going to be talking about today is how here at Earth Regenerators, we're specifically doing something at odds with most training programs. And we're doing it very intentionally because we understand that what's really needed is ongoing social supports that are given and received and co-created as we go about changes in our lives. And that these learning journeys at Earth Regenerators are not about accumulating some amount of content knowledge. Like I have now taught you how this ecosystem functions, or I have taught you how to build a house, or where it's focused on the content of the learning. Really, we focus a lot more on the process of building relationships, using content that is helpful for that, so that our relationships can continue in whatever form makes the most sense. And so today we're going to be talking about how we can create the conditions of thriving in our lives so that we can become regenerators of the earth for the rest of our lives. And just to give a moment of levity and seriousness to what is happening on the global stage at the moment, which is sort of a mixture of profoundly toxic information warfare and sadly and disturbingly slightly less toxic use of military warfare. It's actually more toxic what's happening in the information environment than what is happening with bombs being dropped in cities in Ukraine, which is a difficult thing to fully recognize. But I want to just place briefly in context that when we see resource wars taking place between nation states that have been gamed so that psychopaths become their leaders, and they're able to manipulate their populations in the way that we discussed in our webinar last week with the insights of Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays, that what is happening on the world stage should be completely expected and predicted. And actually, I remember reading a book in the mid-90s saying that within the next 20 years, we would get to more than 95% of armed conflicts being about resource scarcity. And this is actually the case. When we see someone using military might against someone else, it's because there are too many humans with too much consumption, and we're more than 50 years into ecological overshoot, and these kinds of conflicts are completely predictable. And so we're going to be talking today about how to become support systems to each other as we live regeneratively, as these kinds of highly predictable patterns continue to intensify in highly predictable ways. Just to say, we need to cultivate the emotional capacities to live through and continue being psychologically well, to be able to function well as human beings, as a lot of things get worse. And the place where most of us will experience the worst parts of it is in the realm of information, which means I'm not being bombed right now, but I can look on Facebook and see pictures of people being bombed. And it's going to generally be the case at any time that the majority of humans are being affected mimetically, meaning they're being affected by the spread of information, and that the harm is being done there. And that's why the information warfare is so subversive and so difficult to wrap our heads around how dangerous it is. Because we need to be able to do healing work for the planet as more and more of us become susceptible to just spreading harmful information about bad things that are happening that were predicted decades ago and really are disturbingly like they're arriving right on schedule. And so I don't say that to depress us. I just say that to acknowledge that we're in a place that those of us who see the world through the lens of ecology are going to see the world very differently than most human beings, because most human beings were not trained in ecology and do not understand what happens when a population overshoots its carrying capacity and what happens when the scarcity of resources combined with inequality in the distribution and access to those resources creates dominance hierarchies and violence, which again, something we should expect to occur. And so with that in mind, what I want to do today is actually take the seriousness of this moment of one nation state invading another for a resource grab, to ponder that nation states are a temporary artifact of human history and they won't last much longer. And that the vast majority of nation states are less than 100 years old. Most of them came into being in the 20th century. Do you remember World War I was mostly monarchies still battling with each other in early fledgling nation states? And so this idea of nation states that seems so lasting and permanent is actually a blip in history. And so as we start to think about bioregional scale organizing in territories around watersheds and things like this, going back to ancestral lifeways, we're just going to be moving beyond the age of fossil fuels into a time where that will be the only thing that makes sense, as it was the only thing that made sense before. And so with that said, I'd love to start sharing my screen to be able to discuss how is it that we create the conditions for thriving after this learning journey, where I'm using the word thriving, even though I just said that life is going to be increasingly difficult. And so here I mean thriving as in we're fully alive and our health and well-being are basically intact. And when we enter times of difficulty, we're able to recover. That our psychological capacities include resilience to manage difficulty and continue functioning well. And that that's an important part of thriving. And that the learning journey is just this 8-week period where we're formally holding this pattern of weekly webinars and community calls. So after that learning journey continues the real one, which is how to live in these times and how to support each other. And I'd like to begin by just remembering what it was like for us 8 weeks ago, as we started exploring what it means to leave the regular world and go into a place that tells us the future is pretty scary and difficult. And more importantly, the future is not going to be like the past. And so as we break down the illusion of projecting the past onto the future, it can be quite scary and uncertain. But what we found in the last 8 weeks is that actually, by learning to connect with our bodies and feel emergence as it's occurring, and learning how to create social supports with each other so we're not alone, that it doesn't have to be a scary path like this image suggests. And the question I want to explore with you today is something we might ask in this way. All of us here came into the learning journey of Earth Regenerators. And the question is, where do we go from here? As we came into this sort of rhythm of continued activity for the series of 2 months, and then afterwards we come out of it, where might we go? And what I want to suggest is that within the Earth Regenerators community, just as a place to start, not because I think it's the only place we should go, that actually a lot of structural supports have been put in place. And that 3 of the most robust at the moment are the people who are figuring out how to create supports for each other through what's currently being called the Earth Regenerators Fund. Just basically how we are practicing providing financial, knowledge, social, and other forms of support to each other within the Earth Regenerators community. A second area that's really become quite mature and quite complex is the bioregional catalysts group in Earth Regenerators, which is where people are dividing into smaller focused groups around a variety of topics to ask themselves, how do I, as an individual person, become part of the transformation of a bioregion somewhere on Earth so that I can work at that larger territorial scale wherever I'm living? And that's a space that there's a lot of opportunity to continue your learning journey into those discussions, into those groups. And then also, as we've talked about before, we have the Regenerative Project Incubator, which is a place where people go to give and receive support in the context of mentoring, clarifying their ideas, learning how to ask for help, mapping out their needs, inviting people to join them in the things they care about addressing or the projects that they're trying to create. And these are 3 places that after the learning journey, you're welcome to go to. But actually, there are lots of ways to continue So if you look at how you might leave this learning journey and continue just looking at the Earth Regenerators ecosystem, you can join the check-in group, which is a place where people are just giving ongoing social support to each other. You can go to the book club where they do deeper dives into a variety of topics, reading books and watching films together. There's pro-social groups for Earth regeneration, the regenerative parenting group, campfire talks, Seeds Explorers, which is looking at alternative economies and cryptocurrency. And there are even other groups than these, but these are all well-established groups with their own rhythms of meeting and interacting with each other. And so after the learning journey, you could join any or multiple of these. And that's just within Earth Regenerators. So the point I'm making here is that we are actively trying to create ways to weave each other together so that our relationships stay in the community in a way that allow us to continue giving and receiving support to each other. Because we have a long journey ahead of us that will last for the rest of our lives. And of course, we're here to help each other. Yeah, I'm here to help you. Like here, anytime you need me, reach out and I'll be there for you. You can send me a message, we can have a call. But really, I'm like another representative in the community, because anyone else in this community that you've become friends with, you can reach out to and they will respond, because we are grounding this work in friendship. This is not a professional environment. We're not an organization. We're a community of people who care about regenerating the earth. And we have such deep commonality around that mission that we will want to support each other, and we'll be open to becoming friends and forming meaningful personal relationships so that we actually do know how to help each other. And I think this is really fundamental. It should be so obvious that friendship is the basis of the regenerative movement. But I don't think it gets said enough, because people go and look for teachers, they look for experts, they look for certification, and all of those things have their place. But more fundamentally, we need to be able to be friends with each other. And in our friendship, during our hard times, we have shoulders to cry on and people who can understand us, people who may cry with us. And when we're doing well, we'll have people who celebrate us and understand what it really meant for us to get to where we are. And one way you can look at this, and this is only one of many, is to look at how the Regenerative Project Incubator, how we're thinking about its relationship to the Earth Regenerators Fund. And this is something that is a work in progress. It's going to continue evolving. But basically, what we see is that anyone who enters the Regenerative Project Incubator will find an entirely human social support system, meaning a web of relationships of people helping each other. And this support system helps whoever comes into the project incubator to refine their projects and align their lives with being regenerative. And what this means is that anyone who enters this space has their needs clarified. They learn what they actually need in this space. And then from the Earth Regenerators Fund, a process of mobilization occurs. And what that means is that whatever resources or supports are needed are going to be gathered and found among the web of human relationships to help the people in the project incubator to manifest their dreams. So if your dream, like mine, is to bring a river back to life, or if your dream is to set up an agroforestry project, or if your dream is to work with community healing and community trauma, or to create conditions of peace in places of violence, whatever it may be, as you enter into this supportive space, the people around you will learn what you're trying to do, and they'll learn about you, and they'll discover who you are and what kind of help you might need. And then because all of this is based in caring about each other and friendship, we start to look for ways to help each other, and we start mobilizing the supports that are needed to help us learn to live regeneratively. What that means is, in practice, the Regenerative Project Incubator is actually the Regenerative People Incubator. Now, what we're learning how to do is cultivate ourselves as human beings and each other as webs of human beings to be able to live regeneratively. And we're incubating this in the sense that it's during the times when we can't do it on our own that we need an environment that supports us to help us get to the place where we can. And by the time we can do it on our own, we don't have to, because we have this web of support around us which allows us to turn around and help others who actually are not able to do it on their own yet, to bring them into that fold. And over time, we accumulate capacities to live regeneratively for more and more people. And this is what I talked about as cultural scaffolding near the beginning of this learning journey. We become the scaffolds to each other to incubate our projects and then gather the resources and supports we need to be able to do them. So just like a living organism navigating its space, we're going to gather what we need in real time from our environments. Now, a few examples might be that you need financial support. You might need other people to do the work with. It may be that there are things you don't know that someone else does and they share the knowledge with you. You might seek mentors and advisors or simply need emotional support. Or it could be something very practical like, I need to fly from one place to another to join a regenerative project and I don't have the money for an airline ticket. And maybe someone else has frequent flyer miles and they just gift me an airline ticket. So you see, it may not be financial support, but it's logistics support. But the important thing is, because we've built trusting relationships with each other, we'll actually know that the other person has good intentions and that we can help them. And so if I see someone who needs help and I'm in a position where I can help, I'll feel good to do so. Then the idea is we want to create an environment that dynamically works in this way, that whatever you need at any time will be gathered to you as you need it by your friends who are helping you as you become more regenerative. And that you in turn are able to help others in the same way because they're your friends too. So that's the idea of the Earth Regenerators Fund and how it relates to the project incubator. But you see, it doesn't matter that those, we don't really know where one of them begins and the other ends. What matters is that we just live this way, learning how to help each other. Another element of this is that in the Earth Regenerators Fund, we are gathering resources where we can form a giving circle, where there are some among us who have more financial resources, more time available, more expertise, whatever it may be that they can give to help others. And that members of the Earth's Regenerators community become equivalent to like a fellow who receives a fellowship. And I'm using the word fellows here in quotes in a light way. Basically, you can be a member of the Earth Regenerators community and not be seeking this kind of support. But if you seek this support and the community gives it to you, then it's like you're becoming a fellow of the community. You're becoming someone who's an ambassador, a representative, a worker, someone who's doing things that help the community to make an impact in the world. So for example, right now we're talking with the Regen Foundation that is part of the Regen Network about possibly receiving a large amount of financial support that would allow us to dynamically invest in and support people and projects across the community of Earth Regenerators. We also have members of the Earth Regenerators community who have been approaching me and approaching others in the community about possibly donating money to help convert private land into community land, to set up land stewardship, or to be able to give money and donate it into a pool of assets that allow us to support each other in this way. And what's interesting is as we do this work and a growing number of us are supported and all of this learning that occurs as we do it, we're continually evolving a community of practice by learning how to catalyze and regenerate entire bioregions. Now, because we have the Bioregional Catalysts group, which is trying to form itself like a craftsmanship guild, meaning a group of people who increasingly strengthen their practice in their lives, that anyone who becomes a fellow of Earth Regenerators, or whatever we end up calling it, who is supported, who is supported by the community to do this work, becomes a teacher or someone who just shares what they're learning and others learn from their sharing. So they might be blogging or making short videos or other things. People may visit them and learn from them to be mentored. But that what comes to happen is, as we support each other to live regeneratively, we become people who help other people live regeneratively by catalyzing the context that we live within and the social community online as an evolving community of practice. The core idea looks like this. There's always a flow of learning, just like has happened here in this learning journey. And some of us decide that we really are ready to live regeneratively, and we start seeking the social support. And right now I'm just giving that a name for the sake of it, making it more clear. We might currently call those Earth Regenerators Fellows. But notice you don't have to apply to be a fellow. What you do is you go to the project incubator and start developing your capacities until you are ready to receive support. And when you start receiving support, because the Earth Regenerators Fund is the same web of friendships, people will know when you need help and they'll start giving it to you and helping you to have it. That then you become someone who is starting to help catalyze bioregions and enter the community of practice with other people who are doing the same thing. And behind all of this, supporting it, is the collection of resources that enable us to do this continually, including those of us who are Earth Regenerators Fellows, start bringing back our gifts and our abundance in knowledge, access to local communities, institutional support, financial support, or whatever it may be, to join the giving circle and continue the whole process. Similar to how university endowments are created by people who graduated from universities and went on to have successful lives, and then they felt like giving back. That if we're successful at creating regenerative livelihoods for more and more people, and we're successful at creating more on the ground commons of community projects, the value created in those projects can be reinvested back in the community in ways that feel appropriate to all of us doing this work. Now, I want you to notice how this is so different from how most regenerative education is done today. Like, I want to show you where the cultural scaffolding is missing in most of the world right now. And you're probably all going to find this very familiar. So you might get your permaculture design certificate, right? Or you might get a master's degree in regenerative leadership from one of the programs that's now offering it. Or maybe you learn to design an eco-village from Gaia Education or someplace like that. Okay, so you've got this education, you paid the money to take the course, the expert taught you, but now what do? You have your certificate, but you don't actually get deployed or invited into a community to practice. You don't actually have the money or the resources to help you make those changes. And you're left just as lost and alone. But now you're frustrated because you know more about what you should be doing, but you never got the social supports to help you move forward into practicing doing it. So you see, this is the standard problem of regenerative education right now. And I summarized it in a very stark way like this. Most regenerative education focuses on content, but its core financial model remains extractive simply by accident, which is that the organizations that offer regenerative education need to make money to be able to pay their staff to offer those courses, so they charge you money to take them. So you go and you pay money to someone to teach you. And then afterwards, you don't actually have a pathway to continue. You've gained some knowledge and given up some money, but you haven't joined a social support system because the financial model is based in the context of nonprofit organizations who are living in a place of financial scarcity, who need to make money to make their programs viable, and they don't have the capacity to focus on building these social relationships. And so it's not their fault they have extractive financial models, it's that that's the environment that they emerged within. And sadly, this is most regenerative education today. And you can see what we're doing here at Earth Regenerators is very much the opposite. We focus on regenerative processes of building relationships. We never have an extractive financial model. All of you who joined this learning journey were asked to donate $30 to receive a copy of my book, which covered the book and the shipping, and any surplus money went into one of our regenerative funds, the Earth Regenerators Fund or the Bari Chara Regeneration Fund, to create commons of regenerative activities that you yourself can join after the learning journey. So you see how we're doing our work very differently than the standard model. And I want to give a really powerful example of why this is needed. Look at how many millions and millions of young people are engaging in climate activism right now. A lot of them leave their high schools or leave their universities to go and join climate marches. But then they go right back to high school or right back to college on the path to being trained for corporate jobs that are not going to exist while they are not participating in the regeneration of the earth. So my question is, why should these young people go back to school? when they could do what I've been talking about in the last 15 or 20 minutes, which is what if they were instead to be given regenerative education that places them in on-the-ground projects and gives them the social supports they need to live and work and develop themselves while they do ecosystem restoration, while they do reforestation, while they do community development work. And what if we created a context where 2 million of these young people all over the world could drop out of college right now and go and join permaculture projects, eco-villages, reforestation projects, and gain the social supports they need to just live and work there as the replacement for their education. And we use global digital communications infrastructure to coordinate among them, like we're doing in this learning journey to coordinate among us. See, this is the model of bioregional education that I've talked about in my book, and that is explored throughout the Earth Regenerators community. Notice how this also is about the decolonization of education. You don't go to a formalized educational institution within the model of civilization so that you can participate in the global economy. Instead, you build relationships that are inherently regenerative while participating in work on the ground, helping to regenerate communities and landscapes as the way that you learn. And because you build relationships while doing that work, you gain the support you need to keep doing it, to stay in the same place or to go to another place. And if we build our educational models in this way, including all of us here living this way, we will be able to live out the regenerative movement and regenerate the earth together. And so this is how I'm doing it. This is a picture of the rural area of Barichara that's called Lubigara. You can see this trail that's coming down the cliff, that little line coming down the cliff, that brings you to the land we're negotiating to purchase right now. That is the Las Albercas land, where we're setting up the Barichara Ecoversity. And what I want to explain to you about the Barichara Ecoversity is that this is going to be community land. We're buying this land so that it can serve the territory, and so that anyone who comes to help do regenerative work in Barichara will have housing and places to stay, that can do work exchanges for food and cost of living, so that they can be trained in regeneration without having to pay for their education. Because this piece of land will become commons land. It will be community land for the Earth Regenerators community. And the people who are helping buy this land, which are part of this is the Earth Regenerators community. We are negotiating to buy this land right now, so that any of you who wants to can come to Barichara and help us birth the Ecoversity. And the members of the Earth Regenerators community will try to help you find the supports you need to do it. Notice how different this is from getting a certificate, like getting a college degree, and then being left to just compete in the marketplace. We're talking about permaculture design of human relationships as regenerative education. And yes, this is the project I'm involved in, but there are other people in Earth Regenerators doing their own, and you may start your own or already have one that you can invite people to join. So the idea is basically like this. The flow of learning is going to be built upon the fact that we are creating commons of various kinds. Probably the two most important commons are the commons of friendship, of human relationships that we all share, the commons of land that becomes community land, and the commons of knowledge that we share with each other that allows us to do things, which then gives rise to social supports. And the social supports are what hold the flow of learning so that we can interact with each other continuously. You don't have to stop interacting with me because you're not in the learning journey anymore. You're going to interact with me or other people in this community because you're going to be living regeneratively. And you're going to be living regeneratively together with those of us in this community, to the extent that you would like to do so. And what this means is we sustain each other during the rest of the collapse process, which is how we learn to thrive as we move forward. And we sustain each other by regenerating landscapes, and we sustain each other's so that we can regenerate landscapes. And these things absolutely must occur. So As the world around us collapses more and more quickly, we are going to need these social supports. And as I have been learning in my body-based practice, it is absolutely profound what happens when you can spend your time every day on community land, healing landscapes. The need for daily healing with land is going to become more and more important. I can watch the global events that are occurring right now and hold the emotions of the pain and the loss and the trauma, because every day I am regenerated by my daily body work, by my work on the land, and by the community of friendships that sustain me as I go about my life in this way. And I want each of you to have exactly the same thing in your own way, in your life. And of course, what this means is, as we set up these community projects, like we did for the for the nature reserve Orientalagua, which was bought by Earth Regenerators last year, is just like Kathy here. Kathy is a lovely lady from the Earth Regenerators community that came and hung out with my daughter Elise and helped us do some regenerative work on this land. All of you are invited to join me in Barichara and do this. But more fundamentally, more basically, you're invited to find your own ways into these supports wherever they make sense among this web of friendships that has been cultivated with you in the last 8 weeks, so that we can gather physically together in this way and support each other as we regenerate the earth. So it's very important that now thousands of people have gathered in Earth Regenerators. There are almost 3,600 of us as of today. And we know that the planet is in overshoot and collapse. We've crossed 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries. And we need to live into the future that we know is coming with open hearts, with the tenderness that that entails. And at times there will be tears in our eyes. And we know what must be done. We must dedicate ourselves to regenerating human communities and ecosystems and landscapes. We must find a way to live and organize our lives in this way for the rest of our lives. And that does not end on Monday when the last community call of this learning journey is over. We're ready to begin the next stage of our work and our relationships together. And so it's time. Let's talk about how we can walk this path together. So this is, for me, an incredible moment. And I want to tell you why. Because a week ago, when I had the conversation with someone from the Regen Foundation, and they started telling us how they wanted to invest in the Earth Regenerators community to manifest what I just showed you. And they did it because of the way we build relationships with each other. Because an investment from the Regen Foundation is to share the governance and decision-making of the Regen network, which is a planetary scale network of spreading regenerative practices using blockchain technology and a variety of things in ecological economics. And some of you, I see some very friendly faces, were on the call yesterday when the Earth Regenerators Fund governance group talked about the Regen Foundation and the Regen network. And we all held the seriousness that they wanted to enable us to do this. And what that means is, this is not idle talk. This isn't Joe being an inspirational speaker. This is our real opportunity. Our real opportunity is to become friends with each other and learn how to ask for the help that we need, and go to the places in the community where that help is being offered and offer help there as well in the ways that we can each do, and carve out the pathways that enable us to live this way. Because I'm afraid to say that there will not be enough of us doing this. And we all have a part to play. And so with that said, I'd love to just open it up to questions and comments. I'm happy to clarify more of how the Earth Regenerators community is trying to do this, or just anything personally that has come up for you that you'd like to explore further. So are there any questions or comments? Let's give this a moment then as it settles in. Let's take a moment to breathe. Just a moment of deep breath. Breathe in the pain and the suffering and the darkness, and breathe out, I'm alive. Breathe in, I can feel so much around me, it's too much. And breathe out, let it go. I have to focus on being healthy. And then breathe in, I want to be part of what heals the earth. And breathe out, and I can. Because if we just watch the things that are happening in the world around us and feel powerless, it's gonna kill us. It's gonna be too much to bear. But if we create these supports to each other, and I can attest personally, it has been amazing the levels of peace and joy that have come back into my life because of the way that I live. And this is available to each of you because the earth needs her humans to do this. So are there any questions?
Well, I'll speak up and share. I'm sure I'm not the only one who is deeply moved and yet still deeply scared. Like, I've been lied to so many times by people promising some kind of wonderful future. And I realize this isn't necessarily a promise as much as an invitation to join in creating one. And I'm still terrified.
I think that's a very healthy response, Stephen. Very, very healthy. Urvi, on to you.
Thank you. That was a profound and very moving presentation. The thing and I particularly loved what was said about the limitations of current regenerative education and ways of doing things. Like, that resonated very much. What I'm curious about is, what might it look like to have a regenerative education platform such as the one we're trying to create here, that is not tied to the extractive model? Because from what I can tell, still most of what I'm able to spend money on is tied to the extractive model. So where does this kind of, like, before the new paradigm is built, where does the funding for the new paradigm flow from? If that makes sense.
Yeah, there are two pieces to this. One is the decolonization of wealth, which is those who have accumulated some wealth can choose to release colonizer patterns. So an example would be taking private land and turning it into community land, would be taking the enclosure movement that started modern day capitalism and turn it into commons based land. That would be a decolonization of wealth. So there are things like that can be done. But there's another thing that is maybe a bit more technical that comes out of the theory of evolution, which is the question, how does evolutionary novelty occur? Where something that never existed before comes into being. And I remember reading an amazing collection of essays by Ernst Mayr, who's one of the most important biological, like biologists and philosophers of biology of the 20th century. For those who know biology, like Ernst Mayr was sort of like a huge overarching figure for the significance of his work. And I remember reading an essay by him where he explained how lungs arose for breathing air outside of the water. So, 280 million years ago, there were these amphibious fish. And what happened was they had swim bladders and they had gills. And it turned out, just by happenstance, their swim bladders, which is a little air sac, It changes the buoyancy of the body of the fish, so the fish can go up and down in the vertical column of the water. That those swim bladders are rather lousy lungs. They don't work very well as lungs. But because the fish can breathe oxygen from the water with its gills, the lungs actually don't need to work. And so the insight that he had was that lungs for breathing outside of the water came about because there was no evolutionary selection against it, which means if they had to survive while breathing with their swim bladders, they would have just gone away because they couldn't survive. But because they could survive with their gills and then occasionally breathe a little gulp of badly internalized air from their swim bladders, that over several generations, the swim bladder became functional lungs. And here's the lesson. There are structures that can exist in a current environment to maintain survival. And there are novel ways of living that cannot survive in that environment. But if they can be protected long enough while those core functions are maintained somewhere else, they can co-evolve in parallel until they can function. And this insight tells us that we must depend on the extractive economy while building the pathways to transition. And we must emotionally and ethically tolerate the paradoxes that that creates, so that our economic models that are not viable will be able to, because other economic models are supporting them. And so an example would be philanthropy until you have a sustainable business model. Like we gather donations to pay someone to practice earning a living until they can earn a living on their own. To like supporting social entrepreneurship would be like you can see how the logic would be the same there. And so one thing I'm doing here in Barichara is at the beginning of January, I raised the money to support a woman in our community for an entire year so that she could spend the year figuring out how to build different business models for herself and the web of women in the community she works with. So what I did was I gave her the gills to her swim bladder. I gave her the time to prototype economic models that may not work until she can find models that do without the financial pressure to make an income. Because I know she's a successful entrepreneur, meaning I know she's successful at creating models that work because she's done it before. So that way of thinking is going to be really important for how we support each other, as we relax the survival pressure to be able to continue. So that's a really important element of this. And thank you for asking. It's a really important question. Pamela, I see you'd put a question into the chat. Would you like to speak to that? Do you have a question? Start out, Pamela?
No, just what's in the chat. Thanks, Joe.
Okay. Pamela is asking if I could speak to the systems complexity paradigm shift in this vision. So some of you know that I'm actually trained as a complexity scientist. I went to the University of Illinois in Champaign because I wanted to join the Center for Complex Systems Research. And my way in was to study satellite remote sensing in an atmospheric science department. And I started learning climate science. One of the things that came to me from studying complexity science as a person who was previously trained in philosophy and in physics was that an element of complexity that's really a profound shift in thinking is that it's better to have less knowledge and be confident in the knowledge that you have than to have more knowledge and have the knowledge be incorrect because of faulty assumptions. And the way that plays out in complexity science is they use difference equations instead of differential equations. So instead of using calculus, they use algebra. And so the reason that they do that is they say the current state determines the next state by some equation, but the equation is just a relationship from one state to the next, where you don't pretend to know what continuously happens as you move from one state to the other. And it turns out that's important because if you assume continuity of knowledge, when your knowledge is incomplete, you actually introduce all kinds of biases. And you end up distorting the information field. And this comes out of work in chaos theory. Chaos theory tells us that sensitivity to initial conditions can dramatically change the future forecast, which means if you have a slight uncertainty early on, the uncertainty grows rapidly. But the other version of that is if you have faulty information, your errors grow rapidly too. And so one of the things about shifting to the paradigm of complexity is to look for things like, is this pattern becoming more stable or less stable, rather than how well do I know the details of the pattern. So there's some really subtle shifts in philosophy of knowledge like this that have profound consequences. And one of the really problematic misunderstandings about complex systems is people think you can't predict them. I'm so annoyed by that. Like, you can't predict them. And I'm like, how many times do I have to tell you you can't? Do you want me to show you? Because I'll give you an example. Let's say you have like an oak tree and it's the autumn, so that the leaves are falling. If you watch an individual tree, oak leaves are kind of wide, they're broad leaves. So as they're falling, they're doing this and they're jumping left and right as they come down. You cannot forecast, you cannot predict the exact pathway that that leaf is going to take as it falls to the ground. And that's what chaos theory says. But if 1,000 leaves fall from the same tree, with very high confidence, you can predict the statistical distribution of leaves at the bottom, which is that most of them are going to fall close to the tree and less of them further away unless there's a crosswind, right? So this ability to shift from predicting the specific trajectory into the future and instead looking statistically at the accumulation of patterns for the behavior of this kind of system allows you to predict really well certain things and really badly other things. But if you don't understand that difference, you'll just think it can't be predicted. So this sort of thing about living with complexity means we give up the illusion of control and we stop trying to know things really well. And there's a really strong tendency, a psychological tendency, to try to map systems in really high detail and gather lots of data to map systems. And that actually is a psychological trauma response to feeling like we need to control things. Because actually, we're going to probably map it badly. And even if we map it well, we just spent all of our time and energy mapping a system that has now changed by the time we finish mapping it. And so what we'd be much better at is to paraphrase Fritjof Capra, is we need to learn to dance with the system. We need to learn how to dance with it. How do you dance with something? How would I dance with you? We feel the rhythm and the beat of the music. We move together to the beat of the music and we express ourselves joyfully or in whatever way makes sense for the kind of dance we're doing as our bodies are structured in space. So maybe you start waving your hands in the air. So I start waving my hands in the air. I move a little closer, you move back, and then we go back and forth. And what happens is our interaction and the shared patterns of rhythms tell us how to create together. And so if I know the rhythm and I know how to interact, I know how to dance with you. Right? If I'm doing waltzing or swing dancing or free form ecstatic dance, I basically know the rules of the dance, the rules for how to interact, and I know the beat or the rhythm of the music. And that minimal information tells you how creativity can happen within the system. And so this way of dancing with complexity is profound in the beauty that it generates. And profound in how much we don't need to objectify and control and map systems. And how much that releases us to just participate co-creatively in the moment with what the system is doing. And so there's a lot to say, Pamela, you've opened a can of worms. We could have a PhD conversation for like 3 or 4 years on this. There's so much to explore here. But you can already see just how different the whole philosophy of interaction is when you embrace what complexity means. It's absolutely liberating. It's so beautiful. So I see that another question has come in, or some commentary from Catherine. Catherine, would you like to come on screen and share what you were writing in the chat for us to explore this a little bit?
Sure, I'm not using video, but I'm happy to join you by audio. And I've been just smiling with absolute delight. And in the very beginning, when you asked how we were, and of course, we're all standing with Ukraine and watching that with great concern, and you're absolutely right about the memes being even worse than the bombs. I gave a thumbs up because of this, because of what you are doing with your life and your work, and all of Earth Regenerators and all of kindred spirits who are moving together in this direction. And because we've been talking for many years, that my own PhD work, which took, oh gosh, 12 years and 3 separate PhD attempts, it was definitely not a linear path, is very closely related to yours in spirit and in motivation and in what we think it's good for. And you described it so beautifully, because you're absolutely right that it isn't about the chaos. It is about the wisdom of guiding complex systems in wiser directions, both as a catalyst and sort of knowing how to nudge them. And as we dance with them, knowing how to nudge them wisely and guide them wisely. These are ancient ways, but they're ancient ways that we can bring into the future in a very much needed ways for the regeneration. And I know that my direction, partly of necessity to keep from starving as an eternal grad student, and partly by nature because it happens to be part of the gift that I can bring to the world, is to use computers to help us understand more clearly the nature of the complex systems of all those thousands of leaves falling. Imagine that instead of 1,000 leaves falling, we're talking about thousands and thousands of Earth regenerator communities with the people and the landscapes all around the world in all kinds of different contexts. But there are ways that we can use computers to help us learn from one another and also learn from the complexity of what we're all trying to do together, both on a human to human sense and on a human to landscape and landscape ecology sense and human ecology sense, how everything fits together. There are ways we can use computers not only to earn value, to make it even easier for us to all go do this together without starving, without starving before we have regenerated our deserts. And I'm actually calling in from the middle of New York City right now. And I'm not in Manhattan at the moment, but I grew up also partly in Manhattan. So when I think of places and landscapes, I'm trying to include not just deserts that need healing or any landscape with soil that needs healing, but 2 other examples: urban landscapes, including even, old malls and old parking garages and things covered in cement and high rises and apartment buildings and the whole scale, and favelas, where you have very high density, not a lot of wealth, but you have a lot of human wealth and human energy that can be brought to doing things wisely together to begin to do it immediately. You said earlier that there's not enough, and as the seed of Earth Regenerators with 3,000 going on 4,000 people, definitely not enough. But imagine if this seed could become a catalyst, the seed of this 3,000 or 4,000 people and kindred spirits such as Regen could become catalysts to answer the question that I posed in the text, to provide guidance for how other groups, and I mean really small groups, 100 to 200 people, respecting Dunbar's number and the level at which people can maintain meaningful friendships with one another. I think you're deeply wise about the friendship part of it. That 100 to 200 is key because of the friendship scale and Dunbar's number. But imagine if we could provide wisdom or guidance for how any group of 100 young people could go do this together, or could become more powerfully, they could become the catalyst to lead and bring together other small groups wherever they are. It could be their school, their church, their neighborhood, at every scale, so that we have a Cambrian explosion of a flowering of small groups of people and small scale, in some cases, in a city at least, small scale spaces coming together. And then in addition to urban landscapes, could you imagine this to be mobile in cases where it needs to be mobile, either people living on boats or in a caravan, sort of like gypsies? What if the gypsy could take their regeneration with them? It might be regeneration of a different kind of growing, of sustainable growing, aquaponics, hydroponics, things that could be mobile, but still a regenerative, self-sustaining economy. So the question is, how could we bring our wisdom together and our using computers to help us learn together with this dance to do things and learn wiser ways of doing things much more quickly. We can try things out in silico. We can try things out by computers. You don't have to wait for the forest to grow up for 100 years. We can actually try things with our virtual forests and then know for what to do with our real forests. So I'll be quiet. And those are a bunch of questions.
What I would say as my first response is absolutely the use of computers and computing technology is really important, especially for things like modeling the Earth system, tracking and integrating data and visualizing it and doing scientific storytelling around it and other things like that. So there's a huge realm for the importance of that. And in some other contexts, I've elaborated the argument that the most advanced science ever created is Earth system science, because it combines more than 300 different sciences. So when modeling the dynamic Earth is incredibly complex.
You can do it at very small scales too. You could do it even at level of
I want to comment on your question
humans.
and be able to go on to others as well, which was the problem I see here in the point of focus is that we actually have to change human bodies. We have to change neurochemistry, emotional responses. We basically have to embody changes in ourselves. And this is the part that the computer modeling can't do, which is when we talked about pro-social, we talked about emotion regulation and psychological flexibility and breaking cycles of trauma and these sorts of things, that there's a human scale process in which that occurs. And the vast majority of humans, because of intergenerational amnesia, how many of them live in cities? There's very low eco-literacy, very low nature connection, very low ecological consciousness, and very high levels of trauma and pathological coping behaviors. And so to change those is to change physical systems of human bodies. And so the time lag in doing that becomes an issue of what I've talked about in the context of cultural scaffolding, when I talked about developmental entrenchment. One kind of developmental entrenchment is how long it takes to build ecological consciousness and feelings of the sacred and ecological knowledge embodied in human systems. And anthropologically, we'd probably look back and say that that's a process that accumulates across multiple generations. And we need to attempt to achieve it in 10 years. And so the technological tools we have will help us to do that for sure. But I think the main limitation is going to be human psychology, which is how many of us go on the path of psychosocial development to become people who can live regeneratively, which is partly a process of decolonization and unlearning, and partly a process of psychosomatic healing. And that is something that will not be done on computers. And so I think your point is really important, that there's a lot we can do with computers. It's this other piece that's, I think, is the most important focus, because it's the basis of the sustainable livelihoods.
And how do we help people learn to do that? How do we provide wisdom and guidance so that particular groups can coalesce to a particular oasis, which is a group of people in a place of some kind to regenerate, even if that regeneration is an urban place? And part of the immediate, in terms of the human embodiment, one of the very first things that happens is greenery and tending the ecosystem they're healing of whatever kind that may be, whether it's in containers on cement or bringing a river back to life.
Yeah, the answer I
How
give
do
to
we
that
help
is
people
ensuring
embody it? How do we guide the individuals to help embody it?
the shorthand answer would be train them and practice with them in pro-social. As we've been finding here in this community in the last 2 years, by practicing being pro-social, the way that we open to our deeper emotional capacities, the way that we recover and reconstruct our narrative identities and our histories, the way that we go back and reevaluate our earlier traumas and our coping strategies to manage them, and the ways that we do that in supportive social environments. And then add to that the element of land connection, which is basically practice being pro-social in human groups, and where possible, practice doing it with non-human ecology, like practicing doing it with soil building and with plants and other things. And that's like sort of my shorthand answer, because it's actually, there's a lot to unpack there, but it's this human capacity to build relationships that is foundational. And that's what the pro-social process helps us to do. I'd love to move to Irvi and Mark, whichever you would like to speak, and then to Joy after that. And Catherine, thank you so much. There's a lot of richness here in what you just shared.
Hey, Joe. Yeah, I changed the hand color because this is my kind of 2 questions in one. So one thing that's occurred to me, like dipping into these while Irvi's been doing all of them, is it almost sounds like when you talk about processing trauma and all that stuff, it almost sounds like what we're almost founding is like Planetary Collapse Anonymous or something like that. You know, there's like a whole process that was invented, like, you know, by the guy who founded AA like all those years ago, that like is maybe a useful framework in this. And like, you know, instead of a loving higher power, you have a loving earth or something like that. So I'd just be interested in your thought on that. And yeah, I can see a few faces nodding and a few going, huh? So yeah. And then my other, exactly. My other question was, like, assuming this becomes successful and it scales, we're going to have a lot of bioregions and quite a lot of people. And then we're going to get into the situations of large groups of people trying to figure out how to allocate resources, which is basically leads to politics. And one of the things I do in my spare time is campaign for proportional representation, which is just saying, hey, you've got a voting system, let's make sure everyone's vote counts. And you want to know what a difference that makes, just look at the governments of Finland and Germany compared to the UK and the US. Mm-hmm. You know, the toxicity of politics in the sort of winner takes all systems in the US and UK and other places versus you know, proportional systems like Finland and Germany is sort of night and day. And has there been much thought about that in this movement as you've been building it so far, which is probably too small for it to matter, but long term might. So yeah. Sorry for packing 2 questions into one.
No, those are good questions. For the idea of Planetary Collapse Anonymous, what I found that's really key is just that we have a way of sort of cutting through the bullshit. Like something I found is, if I meet someone that says, oh, electric cars can fix our problem, I'm like, oh my God, reductionistic, techno-utopian. You know, they don't realize that you're gonna have to mine the ocean floor for all the lithium batteries and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's sort of an eco-literacy test that I'm able to do. But it's also a grieving test, like how far are they in the grieving process? Which stage would they be in? The challenge is until you yourself get further in that process, you can't easily assess where others are in it. And so, and notice it's not about hierarchy and superiority, it's about levels of acceptance. And to some extent, systemic knowledge of understanding interdependencies. But I think that the idea of creating group awareness around that, like you could jokingly do with Alcoholics Anonymous, I think is actually quite beautiful, and something that the Deep Adaptation Forum is probably the best current example of, or people who do the work that connects with Joanna Macy, I would say also would similarly be a set of people who have achieved a level of empathy that would be resonant. The other question that you were asking around, sorry, my daughter's here crying in my lap, so I'm comforting her. Lisa, are you okay, sweetie? I got you. We can just keep having hugs. It'll be okay. But I do need my headphones on to be able to speak, so don't get too tangled up in them, sweetie. The other piece of this that I think is really going to be quite powerful is what actually, remind me of your questions. Give me a nod because I looked at my daughter and got myself distracted. The second question was.
I was just asking about if, it becomes successful, we're going to have large groups of people in bioregions. They're going to make resource decisions.
Politics. Yeah, that's right.
And then the voting system aspect of it, just to seed that knowledge in there. Yeah,
the one thing I would say is that there are very interesting experiments with liquid democracy, for those who aren't familiar with it. And actually, we're going to experiment with liquid giving as a variation of liquid democracy in Earth Regenerators, where basically you can give someone proxy votes, but then reclaim it right up to the moment of voting to aggregate trust-based allocation of votes, which is how liquid democracy works. There's some interesting models like this. The thing I think is really key is to go back to Elinor Ostrom and see that while we talked about Elinor Ostrom having 8 core design principles connected to the pro-social framework, we didn't really go into what the 8th core design principle leads to, which is what she called polycentric governance, which is basically every decision context needs to be treated as a commons, and then it needs all 8 systemic capacities of a commons to function, which is why any real democracy that works, regardless of its scale, has a nestedness of what she called polycentrism, which is a variety of different circles of decision-making. And the places where this has been done successfully at large scale is in conservation management. So for things like a collapsed fishery that happens in a coastal estuary that involves a pretty large geography of several 100,000 hectares of land, maybe hundreds of organizations and dozens of jurisdictions, they only are able to sustainably manage it if they create an association of management that distributes the centers of decision-making among the commons that they are responsible for, so each can have sovereignty with sharing of knowledge between them. So regional planning authorities actually do this pretty well. Like if you look at the transportation planning of the Portland metro area in Portland, Oregon, they have grown around polycentric decision-making with all the complexity of an urban landscape. And so the examples of governance being done well, even at pretty complex levels, have been the ones that maintain the integrity of managing a commons effectively. And so the lesson here is that that is also pro-social, because pro-social includes governing the commons. And what it points to is that the increasing complexity of governance needs to continue having pro-social processes. So just to remind a couple of elements of Elinor Ostrom's framework, we need to have fair and inclusive decision-making, fast and fair conflict resolution, equitable distribution of contributions and benefits. You see, just adding those without the others, that implies politics, and that politics needs to function. But also each group that has its own identity and purpose needs to have sovereignty to self-govern. It needs to be able to serve the mission that the group was set up for. And so this is how there's a harmony of co-evolution between the groups that is implicated, meaning they cease functioning if they don't do that. And representative democracy absolutely fails to do that. It's highly gameable. But direct democracy fails to do it as well, which is why the false choice between centralized planning and free market neoliberalism is a false choice, because polycentric governing of the commons is the only thing that has ever worked. And there's a whole conversation we can have around this. But what it tells us is that there is an ecologically based understanding of how incredible complexity can be governed, and governing the commons is the framework for it. Your body with its 30 trillion cells, whatever the actual number is self-governing because of the self-regulating parts that your heart regulates one part, that is connected to your circulatory system, which is connected to your lymphatic system, which is connected to your liver. And there are various self-governing dynamics and polycentric modes of governance. And it actually works. And so this is like biomimicry of politics is what I'm talking about. It's a huge topic of exploration. And the way we create it is we evolve it into being in its context, which means it cannot be prescriptive. It must be emergent from within the governing dynamics of the group itself. But it will conform to Elinor Ostrom's principles if it works. which means we actually have some pretty good principles to work with for designing them. Huge topic, brief summary of commentary. And I would say in Earth Regenerators, we're experimenting with it because we now have about 20 relatively autonomous and codependent groups. And we have evolved relatively well, polycentric governance. But anyone talking about governance in Earth Regenerators will also tell you we're bad at and we have a lot to learn, which means we are continually evolving it. Brief answer to a multi-month conversation. But thank you so much for bringing it up, Mark. It's hugely important. And Joy, I wanted to get to you. You've been very patiently waiting with your hand up for a long time. Please.
Thank you. There were so many threads I could have picked up from, but the one that is currently alive, and I'm just going to speak to that currently alive, listening into the emergence and trying to be in the flow, is this whole idea of inner work and how we set containers for each one of us to be autonomous at the same time, have those support systems in a, I mean, I'm going to say tiny community because, you know, scaling inner work is never too great a thought. But I mean, there have been people who've done it in the past who could raise spiritual consciousness of lots of people, but let's not go there. And as we set this up, I think that there is the one piece that I'm more curious about is, yes, there is beingness, but there is also doing that connects us into the practical world, the outer work, right? Like inner work cannot be in isolation with the outer work, which, you know, you speak to as a somatic movement, whatever, doing land, regeneration, community work. However, the question is like, should we already create a laboratory of work and outer work, like go at it in a scientific and in an artistic way at the same time? What are your thoughts on it?
Because that is that I would go to the philosophical realm of phenomenology, which is basically looking at our sensory experiences and the phenomenal aspects of them, experiencing them as phenomena, and then recognizing that that's where science comes together with mysticism. That's where art in its various forms of music, theater, dance, drawing, all of it, including mathematics and technical developments as artistic expressions, like, you know, like code as poetry is a nice example in software. That what I think is really key is how to align our development of consciousness with the development of consciousness that we increasingly recognize in the rest of the world. So like a river has consciousness. How? Well, you can start with information processing. You can start with, when the cloud arrived, did it arrive at a dry environment or a moist environment? You know, and just see that there's a phenomenal experience of sense making that occurs, even if we don't think of all those things as living beings. Even if we don't, you know, if we have a tendency to not think of them in that way. And so much of this is going to be about how this inner work that each of us needs to be doing is connected to our outward expression of it as part of the inner work. So if I start to feel into, in my own inner work, the consciousness of the river, that gets expressed in how I talk to people in my community about the river. It gets expressed in how much I walk the land. It will be expressed in my bodily movements into the world around me. And it'll also be expressed in who I choose to spend my time with and who I don't. And various things like that. Is this going in the direction you were hoping it would, or is there something else?
It kind of touched on it. I was more talking about creating the feedback loops that are quick enough for us to, I wouldn't say move quickly. We all know it takes forever for us to shift our conscious levels and things like that. But to be able to create those feedback loops with the external environment, so we are dancing, right? Yes, there is a beat, yes, there is a rhythm, but we can pick up the pace, right?
Yeah.
And it's not I'm not anxious. It's not coming from a place of anxiety of like, we should do these things quickly. No, it's not that. It's more on, we are so far behind in the way that we need to listen to Earth, that we need to be in alignment for the things to really, really start shifting at the scale that we can leave this Earth for the future and I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional because it's clear to me is the future generations to come, right? Like, yeah, sorry, I got lost there, but yeah, please
Well,
respond.
I could comment on how we speed it up. The way we speed it up is by replicating it in small scales. And so if there's one person feeling the consciousness of the river, it would be much better if there were 10. And those 10, even better if they do collective sense making. They can each have their own individual work, but they also need to come into a collective sense making. Just to give a concrete example of that, where I showed that map of the picture of the Barichara Ecoversity. What I didn't show in that picture is that the land right above it is my friend Yup and Julia's land. And right above them is my friend Manuela's land. And up at the top of the cliff is the Bioparque. And so it's not 10 hectares of land, it's 30 or 35 almost, because of what's happening between those pieces of land. And so it's important that there are several small local groups of people, each groups of, a couple of people. But because they are sense making about a larger pattern while doing their own work locally, they're doing fractal work because they're shaping their local work around what's happening at a larger scale. Oh, sweetie, you need your daddy, don't you? Yeah. No. Okay, Elise, here's what I'm gonna do. As all of my friends here really care about how you're feeling, and I think that that's super important. So what I'm gonna do, Elise, is I wanna say goodbye to everyone, but I wanna say goodbye in a very, oh, that's what happened, I see. I'll be able to help with that in just a moment. Yeah. Oh, I know, sweetie. So Elise, hey, Elise, let me make an agreement with you real quick so that you can be ready for me, okay? You ready for our agreement real quick? Okay, our agreement is this. I'm gonna say one really nice thing to all my friends here. And then everybody, you can look and watch them. They're all gonna blow you kisses. Is everybody ready to blow kisses to Elise? They're all gonna blow you kisses, which is their way of saying, they're not just blowing kisses. They're saying, I send daddy's love to you. And they know that they're releasing me so I'm free from my call to come and spend time with you. See how that's gonna work? And so Elise, you're just gonna stand here next to me so everybody can blow kisses to you in just a moment, okay? And we're not quite ready because daddy wants to say something really nice first, because they can't release me until I say the really nice thing first. The really nice thing I want to say is simply, we're doing this right now. In the last hour and a half, we are doing what the webinar was about. And so I just want to invite us to keep doing it. Just let's keep doing it. And so I want to say thank you to everyone for being here. We still have the community calls in the next 2 days. You can reach out to me or anyone else here at any time because we'll still be here. And I'm very curious to see what kinds of friendships emerge and how I fall in love with each of you. You know how it is with your friends, right? You discover things and we fall in love with each other. And let's practice falling in love with each other. I'm going to take my headphones out, which means you will not be able to hear me because of a hardware failure in my computer. But if you will unmute yourselves, you can all blow kisses and then say goodbye to Elise so she knows that daddy's actually coming. So you ready?
Hi, Elise. Are you ready?
Bye, Elise. Bye, Joe.
Bye,
Everybody.
Bye,
Bye,
Elise.
Elise.
Bye, Elise.
Bye, Elise.
Bye.
For everybody, and see you all soon.